Before you decide who the villain of this story is, understand one thing. Everyone in this town slept better because of her. They ate her food, thanked her warmly, and never asked why certain doors stopped opening forever. I grew up believing kindness was measured in full plates and quiet smiles, until one ordinary night when I opened something I was never meant to see. This is not a story about a monster hiding in plain sight. It is a story about how easily evil can disguise itself as care, how an entire community can outsource its guilt to one smiling old woman, and how I helped it happen without lifting a single weapon. There are names I was told never to repeat, rules I was taught without realizing it, and a legacy that did not end the day she was arrested. If you think this story is about what my grandmother did, you are wrong. It is about what came after. And if you stay until the very end, you will understand why some things, once frozen, should never be thawed. We thought Grandma was just feeding the neighbors because that was the easiest explanation, the kind that keeps a house standing when the truth would make it collapse. And because every afternoon the same ritual repeated itself with comforting precision. The clink of glass jars, the rustle of paper bags, the soft knock on the door, followed by grateful voices saying thank you, as if gratitude itself were a currency she had learned to mint. The kitchen always smelled like something warm and forgiving. Broth simmering slowly, herbs crushed between patient fingers. And there was nothing in that smell that warned me that the freezer would one day open like a mouth and refuse to close again. The day it happened was unremarkable in every way that matters, until it stopped being so. I came home late, tired in the dull, featureless way that adulthood delivers exhaustion, and the power flickered twice before going out completely, plunging the house into a darkness that felt older than the walls. Grandma called from her room that the candles were in the cupboard above the fridge, and when I opened the refrigerator to find them, the cold rushed out and fogged my glasses, forcing me to wipe them on my sleeve. The freezer door stuck as it always did, protesting with a small crack before surrendering, and that sound, that tiny, brittle sound, still replays in my head because it was the last ordinary noise I heard for a long time. Inside, everything was too neat. Not just neat in the way of an organized person, but neat in a way that suggested intention, care elevated to a principle. Clear bags stacked evenly, each one labeled in Grandma's precise handwriting, the letters rounded and calm like a teacher correcting a child without raising her voice. Names stared back at me, some familiar, some not, each followed by a small symbol, a star or a circle or a cross, and my brain, stubbornly loyal to normalcy, tried to translate what I was seeing into something harmless. Maybe it was meat from the butcher. Maybe the names were jokes. Maybe the cold was making me dizzy. Then I noticed the shape inside one of the bags, the unmistakable curve that no amount of denial can smooth into something else, and the freezer seemed to breathe around me, inhaling my shock and exhaling it back as terror. I closed the door without screaming, without dropping anything, without doing any of the things people in stories do when they discover horror, and that frightened me almost as much as what I had seen. I stood there in the dark kitchen, candle forgotten, listening to the hum of the refrigerator resume as the power came back. And in that hum, I heard all the afternoons of my childhood layered together. Grandma's voice telling me to wash my hands, to sit straight, to eat slowly, because good things deserve respect. I realized then that whatever lived in the freezer had been living in the house with us for a long time, hidden not by locks or lies, but by routine. I grew up believing that our house was a kind of refuge,
a place where people came to be fixed in small, practical ways.
A bad day could be soothed with soup. A fight with a spouse could be eased with a loaf of bread wrapped in a towel. And loneliness could be addressed with a chair at the table and a listening ear. Grandma was famous for that ear. People talked to her the way they talked to priests or bartenders, confessing things they would never write down, trusting that her nods meant understanding and not judgment. I used to sit on the stairs and listen to the murmur of voices below, never quite catching the words, but always sensing the relief that followed, like a fever breaking. Disappearance was a word adults avoided around me when I was younger. They said people moved away, started fresh, found opportunities elsewhere. In a town small enough that everyone's routines intersected, those explanations were flimsy, but no one pushed too hard. We learned early that questions could make you a problem, and problems were inconvenient. Looking back, I can trace a careful pattern I did not see at the time. The man who shouted at his wife in the street and came home one afternoon carrying a jar of stew from Grandma, never to be seen again. The woman who cheated her sister out of an inheritance and left with a basket of pastries and tears in her eyes. The landlord who raised rents without mercy and stopped collecting them altogether after accepting a bag of frozen dumplings. At the time, these were isolated anecdotes, gossip without teeth. Now they line up like stones, marking a path I was too young or too afraid to follow. After the freezer, fear did not come all at once. It arrived in increments, like frost creeping along a window. I told myself I would confront her, that I would demand an explanation, that surely there was one that did not involve the conclusion my mind kept circling like a vulture. But Grandma emerged from her room smiling, candle in hand, and asked if the power was back on. And the normalcy of her presence slammed into me with such force that I nodded and lied, my voice sounding foreign even to my own ears. She patted my arm and went back to bed, and I stood there long after, staring at the fridge as if it might open itself and offer me a kinder interpretation. Sleep became impossible. The house creaked and sighed the way all old houses do, but every sound took on a new significance, a language I was suddenly desperate to understand. I listened to Grandma move through the night, her steps slow but sure, the pause at the kitchen, the soft scrape of a chair. Once, I heard the freezer open and close, that same brittle crack, and I pressed my pillow over my ears as if that could seal me off from reality. In the morning, she served breakfast as usual, eggs cooked just the way I like them, and asked about my work with genuine interest. I watched her hands, steady and clean, and wondered how many times those hands had written names on plastic. I began to notice details that had always been there but had never demanded attention. The way Grandma kept meticulous records in small notebooks, lists of ingredients interspersed with notes about people, observations disguised as reminders. The way she insisted on buying extra freezer space when the old one began to fail, arguing that preparedness was a virtue. The way she corrected people gently but firmly when they spoke about forgiveness, suggesting instead that accountability was kinder in the long run. Each detail slid into place with a soft, horrifying click, like puzzle pieces revealing a picture you cannot unsee. The neighbors kept coming. They knocked with hopeful faces and left with parcels and thanks, and I watched them from the window, counting who had come before and who might not come again. The freezer became a presence in my mind even when I was not near it, a gravitational pull warping every thought. I considered calling the police, imagined the words I would use, the disbelief I would face. I imagined Grandma in handcuffs, her small frame swallowed by the machinery of justice, and the image felt both necessary and impossible. How do you turn in someone who taught you how to read, who bandaged your knees, who loved you without conditions you could articulate? Instead,
I did the cowardly thing and began to read her diaries in secret, waiting until she napped in the afternoon, her breathing deep and rhythmic.
The diaries were not hidden. They sat on a shelf in the living room, spines worn, years recorded in faded ink. That should have been my first clue that secrecy was never her method. She believed in openness, in the power of plain sight to disarm suspicion. The entries were mundane at first: weather notes, reminders to buy flour, observations about my appetite. Then, gradually, the tone shifted. Names appeared, sometimes followed by brief assessments written with clinical detachment. Dishonest, cruel, unrepentant. Other times, there were longer reflections about balance, about the necessity of pruning to allow a garden to thrive. She wrote about justice not as a system, but as a practice, something you do with your hands when institutions fail. Reading those words, I felt a sickness that was not just fear, but recognition. She was not acting in a vacuum. She was responding to stories people brought to her, stories of harm and resentment that had no outlet. She became an endpoint for grievances, a place where anger could be resolved permanently. The town's silence, its refusal to intervene, its appetite for convenient explanations, all of it fed her logic. In her mind, she was not a monster, but a custodian, maintaining a fragile order everyone benefited from, but pretended not to see. The first act of this realization ended the night I confronted her, not with accusations, but with a question I could not swallow anymore. We were washing dishes together, the radio playing softly, and I asked her how she chose who to help. She looked at me for a long moment, water running over her hands. And then she smiled, sadly, and said that help takes many forms, and that sometimes the most generous thing you can do is stop someone from hurting others ever again. Her eyes met mine, clear and unflinching, and in them I saw not madness, but certainty. In that moment, I understood that whatever happened next would not be a rescue, but a reckoning, and that the freezer was only the beginning. The question lingered between us after she spoke, heavy as steam, and I realized she had answered more than I asked, or perhaps exactly what I asked if I was honest about what I had wanted to know. That night I lay awake, replaying her words, "Help takes many forms," until they lost their meaning and became sounds again, syllables detached from comfort. I thought about the way she had said it without hesitation, without drama, like a woman explaining how to mend a hem or salt water for pasta. Certainty, I learned then, can be more frightening than cruelty, because cruelty sometimes doubts itself. I began to live in a split reality, performing the role of grandson by day and investigator by night. By day, I smiled, ate, listened to Grandma's stories about the past, about ration lines and winters so cold they cracked windows, about choices people made when there was not enough to go around. She framed those stories as lessons, gentle warnings about human nature, and I wondered how many of those lessons had hardened into rules. By night, I counted bags in the freezer, memorized names, traced connections, and trying to understand the system she had built. It was not random. There were symbols next to the names, and after weeks of observation, I began to decode them. A star meant repeat offense. A circle meant remorse expressed but not believed. A cross meant collateral damage, someone whose actions had rippled outward and harmed more than one person. There were no symbols for innocence. The town itself seemed complicit in ways I had never noticed before. People spoke openly about grudges, about those who deserved what was coming to them, using phrases like, "someone ought to do something," as if invoking a mythic force rather than a neighbor with a well-stocked kitchen. Grandma listened, nodded, asked careful questions, and I watched how relief softened faces even before she offered food. Confession, I realized, was not just about absolution. It was about transfer. People handed her their anger and walked away lighter, not caring where it went as long as it was no longer theirs. I tried to test the boundaries of her logic, bringing up hypothetical scenarios over dinner, asking what she thought justice should look like in an imperfect world. She answered patiently, always circling back to responsibility and consequences. Laws, she said, were agreements, and agreements only worked when people honored them. When they did not, someone had to step in. She never said that someone was her, but she did not need to. The freezer hummed its agreement in the background. The second act tightened its grip the day I recognized a name on the freezer list before it disappeared from the town. It was a man from the hardware store, loud, dismissive, known for shorting customers on change. I had seen him the week before, standing in our kitchen, complaining about taxes while accepting a container of soup. When his store closed abruptly and his family moved away in silence, something inside me broke loose from denial. This was not history. It was ongoing, and my presence in the house made me an accessory whether I wanted to be or not. I considered leaving, packing a bag and disappearing the way so many others had, but the thought filled me with a shame that burned hotter than fear. If I left, nothing would change. Grandma would continue, the town would continue benefiting from its quiet sanitation, and I would carry the knowledge like a private disease. Staying meant danger, but it also meant a chance, however slim, to interrupt the cycle. I just did not know how without becoming something I despised. The police came closer than I expected. It started with questions, casual at first, an officer stopping by to ask if Grandma had seen someone recently, smiling too much, notebook half closed. Grandma welcomed them with tea and stories, and they left lighter, just like everyone else. But repetition breeds suspicion, and eventually they returned in pairs, their eyes scanning the house in a way that made my skin prickle. Grandma seemed unconcerned. If anything, she appeared energized, as if the approach of scrutiny validated her importance. One evening, after they left, she sat me down at the table and told me she had something to show me. My stomach twisted as she led me not to the freezer, but to the basement, a place I had avoided since childhood. The stairs creaked under our combined weight, and the air grew colder, heavier. At the bottom, she flipped on the light to reveal shelves of jars, boxes of records, maps pinned to the walls with strings connecting names and places. It was an archive, meticulously maintained. She spoke then not as a grandmother, but as a curator, explaining her criteria, her adjustments over the years, how she learned from mistakes. Early on, she said, she had acted too quickly, guided by emotion. Over time, she refined her process, incorporating patience, corroboration, community input. It sounded horrifyingly like best practices. I asked her if she ever doubted herself. She paused, considering, and admitted that doubt was necessary, but paralysis was not. She believed that waiting for perfect certainty was a luxury afforded to those not directly affected by harm. The people who came to her, she said, were tired of waiting. She became their solution because no one else volunteered. As she spoke, I saw how deeply she believed in her role, how it had given shape and meaning to her later years. Taking it away would not just stop her actions, it would erase her identity.
The tension reached a breaking point when the police returned with a warrant. This time there was no tea, no small talk. They searched the house while Grandma sat calmly at the table, hands folded, answering questions with polite brevity. I stood in the hallway, heart pounding, as they opened the freezer. The silence that followed was absolute. When they led her away, she looked at me not with anger or betrayal, but with something like relief. She squeezed my hand and told me to take care of things, as if she were leaving on a trip and trusting me to water the plants. The aftermath was chaos. News vans crowded the street, neighbors whispered and cried, some in horror, some in defense. Letters arrived, both condemning and praising her. The town fractured along fault lines that had always been there, suddenly visible. I was questioned for hours, asked what I knew, when I knew it, why I did not speak sooner.
I answered honestly, which is to say, imperfectly, and lived with the knowledge that my hesitation had costs I could never calculate. In the quiet that followed, with Grandma gone and the freezer emptied by evidence technicians, the house felt hollow, stripped of its dark purpose, but not its influence. I tried to sleep, to eat, to imagine a future unburdened by inherited secrets. But the basement remained, the archive untouched, boxes of stories and judgments waiting for a caretaker. I told myself I would destroy it, erase the records, end the legacy. Instead, I sat among the shelves and read, learning more about my town than I ever wanted to know, about the small violences that never make headlines but erode lives all the same. The second act closed not with resolution, but with a question that refused to leave me alone. If Grandma was wrong, why did so many people feel safer with her gone, yet mourn the order she imposed? If she was right, what did that say about the systems we trusted to protect us? And if the truth lay somewhere in between, who was responsible for carrying it forward without repeating her sins? The house waited, the records waited, and somewhere between fear and understanding, I realized that the story was no longer just about what she had done, but about what I would choose to do next.
We thought Grandma was just feeding the neighbors because that explanation fit neatly into the shape of our days, and because it smelled like bread and thyme, and sounded like polite knocks on the door, followed by thank yous spoken with relief. It fit because it had always fit. When you grow up in a house where generosity is routine, you stop questioning the frequency of it. You stop noticing how often people arrive desperate and leave lighter. You stop asking where their problems go when they walk back down the steps. The freezer opened the way mouths do in bad dreams, slowly at first, resisting, then yielding with a sound like a bone snapping cleanly. I had only been looking for ice because the power had flickered and Grandma had called out from her room that the candles were above the fridge. The kitchen was dark, the kind of dark that presses close, and when the cold air rushed out, it felt alive, as if it recognized me. Everything inside was arranged with care, stacked evenly, labeled in her tidy handwriting. Names, dates spelled out fully, small symbols beside each one, stars and circles and crosses, patient and deliberate. I did not scream. That came later, when silence had time to ferment. At that moment, I simply closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the hum return as the power steadied, listening to the house resume its breathing. I remember thinking, with a strange calm, that she must have been doing this for years, because nothing new ever looks that practiced. Grandma had raised me in this house. She had taught me how to read, how to hold a knife properly, how to listen without interrupting. People trusted her instinctively. They told her things they never told anyone else. I used to sit on the stairs as a child, listening to the murmur of voices in the kitchen, sensing the weight lift when someone finally stood to leave. I thought that was kindness. I thought that was what it looked like when someone absorbed pain and returned comfort. People disappeared in our town the way socks disappear in dryers, inconvenient but unsurprising. Someone moved away. Someone started over. Someone left town quietly. We accepted these explanations because pressing for more would have required admitting how little we wanted to know. Looking back, the pattern is obvious enough to be insulting. The man who beat his wife and accepted soup one night and never came home. The woman who stole from her sister and left with a basket of pastries and tears in her eyes. The landlord who raised rents without mercy and accepted dumplings with a smile before vanishing into a foreclosure that never quite made sense. After the freezer, fear arrived slowly. It crept into the corners of the house and made itself comfortable. Grandma moved through her routines untouched by my terror, humming softly, asking about my work, serving meals with the same care she always had. At night, I heard her steps in the kitchen, the freezer opening and closing, that brittle sound like punctuation. In the mornings, she asked if I had slept well. I lied because truth felt dangerous. I began reading her notebooks during her afternoon naps. They were not hidden. They sat openly on the shelves, years of careful handwriting documenting weather, recipes, and people. Between notes about frost and flour were observations that made my skin prickle. Assessments written calmly, without cruelty, dishonest, unrepentant, harmful. She wrote about justice the way gardeners write about pruning, as maintenance rather than punishment. She wrote about balance. She wrote about necessity. I confronted her once, clumsily, asking how she chose who to help. She dried her hands and looked at me with a patience that felt endless and said that help takes many forms, and sometimes stopping someone is the kindest thing you can do. Her voice did not shake. Her eyes did not flinch. In that moment, I understood that she did not see herself as hidden. She saw herself as obvious. The police came eventually. At first, they smiled and accepted tea. Later, they returned in pairs, eyes sharp, notebooks open. Grandma welcomed them the same way she welcomed everyone. When they finally came with a warrant and opened the freezer, the silence was absolute. She went with them without resistance, squeezing my hand as if she were leaving on an errand and trusting me to keep the house in order. The trial turned the town inside out. Some people cried for her. Some cursed her. Most did both. She pleaded guilty without drama and spoke about duty and failure and doing what needed to be done. She was sentenced to life. The word landed heavily, full of irony no one commented on. When she looked back at me as they led her away, there was no regret in her face, only recognition. I stayed in the house after. I boxed up the basement archive, shelves of records and maps and strings connecting names to places, and turned them over to the authorities. The basement felt hollow after, like a mouth with teeth removed. I planned to sell the house, to leave town, to build a life that did not hum with implication. Then the freezer arrived. It was delivered without warning, left on the curb like an accusation. New, larger than the old one. No return address. My name written neatly on the paperwork. I called the police. They took notes. They left. The freezer stayed. People began to leave things near it. First, trash. Then, notes. Then, flowers. One night, I found the lid open with a single piece of paper inside bearing a name I recognized. I dragged it into the house and unplugged it, scrubbed it clean, and sat in front of it until dawn. Letters began arriving. Emails from anonymous accounts. Conversations that began as sympathy and ended with expectation. People told me stories of harm that had gone unanswered. They asked what Grandma would have done. They asked what I would do. I told myself I was nothing like her. I told myself listening was not acting. And I told myself pointing people toward legal channels was enough. Sometimes it was, but often it was not. Each failure left a mark. The freezer sat silent and immaculate, a question no one asked out loud. The night everything ended, a woman came to the door, shaking. She told me about a man everyone knew and no one touched. She did not ask me to kill him. She asked me to make him stop. I listened. I documented. I went with her to the police, to the press, to anyone who would listen. It was slow. It was ugly. But it worked. The man was arrested. Others came forward, and consequences followed. The notes stopped. The freezer stayed closed. I sold the house and left town, believing I had chosen differently, believing that was the end of it. Years later, in a city where no one knows my name, I open my freezer one evening looking for ice and find a neatly stacked set of packages I have never seen before, each one labeled in my own handwriting, names written carefully, dates spelled out fully, and on top of the pile, a small notebook open to a single line that I do not remember writing, but recognize instantly. Help takes many forms.